Sometimes the greatest abuse of power begins with a single sentence: "You don't belong here." The marble corridors of the Franklin Federal Courthouse had witnessed decades of history, victories, defeats, and decisions that shaped the lives of millions, but on this cool October morning, before the first rays of sunlight had fully reached the courthouse steps, another story was quietly beginning to unfold. Lawyers hurried through security with leather briefcases tucked beneath their arms. Clerks balanced stacks of files while exchanging polite greetings, and deputy marshals moved with practiced precision through hallways lined with polished stone and portraits of former judges whose solemn expressions seemed to watch every visitor who entered. It was supposed to be another ordinary day inside one of the nation's most respected judicial buildings, the kind of morning where routine was expected and professionalism was assumed. Yet routine has a way of hiding the moments that change everything. Standing near the entrance reserved for members of the federal judiciary was Officer Ethan Walker, a uniformed courthouse security officer whose badge had become more than part of his job. Somewhere along the way, it had become part of his identity. His posture was stiff, his voice carried confidence that bordered on arrogance, and his reputation among coworkers was complicated. Some admired his willingness to challenge anyone who seemed out of place. Others quietly avoided conversations whenever his opinions drifted toward assumptions disguised as certainty. Ethan believed experience allowed him to recognize who belonged inside those marble halls and who did not. In his mind, instinct had become evidence. That morning, instinct was about to fail him. Nearly 50 yards away, a woman walked toward the courthouse without attracting attention. She wore a charcoal gray overcoat over a simple navy dress, carried a worn leather portfolio instead of an expensive briefcase, and moved with calm confidence that required no audience. Her natural curls framed a composed face untouched by anxiety, despite the crowd moving around her. She acknowledged the courthouse custodian with a warm smile, thanked an elderly visitor who held the door open, and continued forward with the quiet dignity of someone completely comfortable in unfamiliar silence. Her name was Naomi Brooks, though almost no one entering the building that morning recognized her. There were no flashing cameras. No motorcade waited outside. No assistants hurried beside her carrying documents. She had chosen to arrive alone for reasons known only to a handful of people. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed that employees who accidentally crossed paths with her instinctively offered respectful nods before quickly continuing on their way, as though recognizing something difficult to explain. But Ethan Walker noticed none of that. What caught his attention instead was what he believed did not fit. He watched Naomi approach the secured hallway reserved for judges and senior court officials. His expression hardened before she even reached the checkpoint. Around them, conversations continued, elevator doors opened and closed, and footsteps echoed against polished floors. No one expected anything unusual to happen. Naomi presented herself calmly, neither hurried nor hesitant, her eyes reflecting patience earned over decades rather than confidence borrowed from authority. She was only a few feet from the entrance when Ethan stepped directly into her path. "Ma'am," he said firmly, extending one arm toward the hallway, "this area isn't open to the public." Naomi stopped without showing surprise. "Good morning," she replied politely. "I'm expected upstairs." Ethan barely glanced at the portfolio she carried. His eyes remained fixed on her face, already convinced he understood the situation. "You'll need to use the public elevators," he answered. "Authorized personnel only beyond this point." Several attorneys slowed their pace just enough to observe the exchange before continuing down the corridor. A court reporter looked up from her phone. A young law clerk hesitated for a brief second, sensing tension she couldn't yet explain. Naomi maintained the same composed expression. "I appreciate your diligence," she said softly. "But I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Ethan folded his arms. His confidence only grew. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from this entrance." There was no anger in Naomi's face, no frustration, no raised voice. Instead, she looked at him with remarkable calm, almost as though she were giving him one final opportunity to reconsider. Then she asked a question so simple that almost everyone nearby overlooked its importance. "Officer," she said quietly, meeting his eyes without hesitation, "are you absolutely sure?" For a brief moment, the hallway seemed to fall strangely still. The courthouse continued moving around them, but something invisible had shifted, and although Ethan Walker believed he had just protected the integrity of the building, dawn had only begun to break over Washington, and before the next sunrise, the badge resting proudly on his chest would no longer belong to him. Inevitably, every extraordinary moment begins long before anyone realizes that history is quietly changing direction. 90 minutes earlier, while the courthouse still rested beneath the pale blue glow that comes just before sunrise, Naomi Brooks left a modest brick townhouse tucked along a peaceful street where maple leaves drifted lazily across the sidewalks. She had lived there for years despite countless opportunities to move into larger homes that better reflected her position. Friends often joked that anyone passing by would assume a retired schoolteacher lived behind the white front door rather than one of the most influential legal minds in the country. Naomi never corrected them. Simplicity had always been a deliberate choice rather than a necessity. She believed respect should never depend on appearances, and every morning she reminded herself that titles carried responsibility, not privilege. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the quiet kitchen as she reviewed a slim folder containing handwritten notes instead of official briefing papers. There were no highlighted speeches or prepared statements inside, only observations she intended to make during the day's confidential administrative review. Over the past several months, concerns had quietly surfaced about inconsistent treatment inside several federal judicial facilities. Anonymous letters described employees feeling dismissed, visitors being judged before they spoke, and subtle patterns that rarely appeared in official reports because they seemed too small to document individually. On paper, each incident looked insignificant. Together, they painted a different picture. Naomi understood that the integrity of any justice system depended not only upon courtroom decisions, but also upon the way ordinary people were treated before they ever stood before a judge. She closed the folder gently and glanced toward a framed photograph resting beside the window. It showed her standing with her late father outside a neighborhood library decades earlier, both smiling despite the rain soaking their jackets. He had spent his life teaching history at a public high school, often reminding his daughter that true character revealed itself most clearly when no one important appeared to be watching. Those words had followed Naomi through law school, years of public service, countless difficult opinions, and every appointment that eventually led her to the nation's highest court. This morning they echoed in her thoughts once again. Her driver had offered to meet her at 7 o'clock sharp, but Naomi politely declined the previous evening. She preferred to arrive quietly without ceremony. Security details, official escorts, and reserved entrances certainly made life easier, yet they also changed the way people behaved. Courtesy offered because of a title revealed very little about genuine professionalism. Courtesy offered to an ordinary stranger revealed everything. As the city slowly awakened, Naomi parked several blocks from the courthouse and chose to walk the remaining distance. Cool autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves while commuters hurried toward coffee shops and subway entrances. She paused briefly to help an elderly man retrieve a newspaper that had slipped from beneath his arm before continuing across the street as traffic lights shifted from yellow to green. No one recognized her. That anonymity felt strangely refreshing. Inside the courthouse, preparations unfolded with familiar efficiency. Maintenance crews polished marble floors until they reflected the ceiling lights like still water. Clerks organized calendars packed with hearings. Deputy marshals exchanged quiet updates before assuming their morning assignments. New employees straightened identification badges clipped carefully to freshly pressed jackets, hoping to make positive first impressions during another busy day. The building functioned like an intricate clock whose countless moving parts depended upon trust as much as precision. Officer Ethan Walker arrived nearly 30 minutes before his scheduled shift, just as he always did. He enjoyed being first because it reinforced his belief that discipline separated dependable officers from everyone else. After placing his lunch inside the staff refrigerator, he walked through the security office exchanging brief greetings with coworkers. Some responded warmly. Others simply nodded before returning their attention to computer screens. Ethan interpreted reserved reactions as evidence that people respected his standards. He rarely considered that some preferred avoiding unnecessary disagreements. Reviewing the assignment board, he noticed he had again been stationed outside the restricted judicial corridor. It was one of the courthouse's most visible posts, requiring officers to identify authorized personnel while directing visitors toward public areas. Ethan appreciated the responsibility. To him, protecting the building meant relying upon instinct just as much as identification cards. Experience, he often claimed, allowed him to recognize confidence that belonged from confidence that merely pretended. Across the hallway, a veteran bailiff quietly watched Ethan prepare for duty before turning toward another employee with an expression that suggested unspoken concern. Neither of them said a word. Sometimes experience teaches people when speaking accomplishes little. Sometimes it teaches them that lessons arrive on their own schedule. By the time the courthouse officially opened its doors, Naomi Brooks had already stepped through the main entrance carrying nothing more than her weathered leather portfolio and the calm certainty that truth, no matter how quietly it arrives, eventually introduces itself. Naomi remained exactly where she stood, her hands resting lightly around the worn leather portfolio while the sounds of the courthouse continued around her as though nothing unusual had happened. A delivery cart rolled across the polished floor. An elevator chimed somewhere farther down the corridor. Two young attorneys whispered over a stack of case files before hurrying toward a courtroom, each stealing a quick glance at the quiet exchange unfolding near the restricted entrance. Most people sensed the tension. Very few were willing to interrupt it. Ethan Walker interpreted Naomi's silence as hesitation rather than confidence. Years of repeating the same assumptions had convinced him that certainty belonged to people who looked familiar and uncertainty belonged to everyone else. He shifted his stance slightly, placing himself more firmly between Naomi and the secured hallway. "Ma'am," he said with measured firmness, "I have already explained that this corridor is restricted. If you have business here, someone can meet you in the public lobby." Naomi nodded politely, neither agreeing nor arguing. "I understand the policy," she answered. "Policies exist for good reasons." Ethan expected her to turn around. Instead, she remained completely still. Her calm unsettled him more than anger would have. There was no nervousness in her voice, no hurried explanation, no attempt to impress him with titles or credentials. It was simply the steady composure of someone who had spent a lifetime refusing to measure her worth by another person's opinion. Imagine standing there while someone decides who you are before asking your name. Imagine knowing that one sentence could change everything, yet choosing patience instead of pride. That kind of restraint is rarely noticed in the moment. It only becomes visible after the truth arrives. Nearby, a courthouse receptionist looked up from her desk, recognizing Naomi from a judicial conference held several years earlier. Before she could step forward, another employee quietly touched her arm and gave the slightest shake of his head. Neither wanted to interfere with an officer carrying out his assignment unless absolutely necessary. They assumed the misunderstanding would resolve itself within seconds. Neither realized those seconds were quietly becoming evidence. Ethan glanced toward Naomi's portfolio. "May I see identification?" he asked. Without hesitation, Naomi reached inside the leather case and carefully removed a simple identification wallet. Before she could fully open it, Ethan lifted one hand. "Actually," he interrupted, "that will not be necessary right now." Naomi looked at him with mild curiosity. "Are you certain?" she asked. Identification usually helps answer questions. Ethan gave a brief smile that carried more confidence than courtesy. "Experience answers questions too." Those words lingered in the air longer than either of them expected. Several feet away, an older bailiff named Samuel Green paused beside a courtroom door. During nearly 3 decades inside federal courthouses, he had watched hundreds of officers begin their careers and dozens retire. He had learned that confidence protected people only when it remained connected to humility. The moment those two became separated, mistakes followed. Samuel considered walking over. Instead, he quietly observed. His instincts told him this conversation was no longer about security procedures. It had become something far more revealing. Naomi slowly returned the unopened identification wallet to her portfolio. There was no frustration in the gesture. If anything, her movements became even calmer. She looked past Ethan toward the hallway beyond him where portraits of former Chief Justices lined the walls beneath warm lighting. For just a brief second, her expression reflected quiet reflection rather than disappointment. She had spent decades believing that justice began long before a judge entered a courtroom. It began with respect offered freely, especially when no title demanded it. Ethan mistook her thoughtful silence for reluctant acceptance. "Thank you for cooperating," he said. "The public elevators are located around the corner." Naomi met his eyes once more. "Officer Walker," she said gently after noticing the name stitched above his badge, "every position of public trust comes with opportunities that never appear in job descriptions." Ethan frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Naomi smiled with remarkable warmth. "Usually," she replied, "we only recognize those opportunities after they have passed." Before Ethan could respond, footsteps echoed from the far end of the marble corridor. They were measured, unhurried, and unmistakably coordinated. Several courthouse employees instinctively straightened their posture. A clerk quietly gathered scattered papers from her desk. Samuel Green lifted his eyes toward the approaching figures, and for the first time that morning, concern crossed his face. Naomi did not turn around immediately. She simply remained standing exactly where she was, patient as ever, while the distance between truth and assumption quietly disappeared one step at a time. The approaching footsteps grew louder until 5 members of the United States Marshal Service rounded the corner in crisp dark suits, their conversations ending the moment they noticed Officer Ethan Walker standing squarely in front of Naomi Brooks. They slowed almost instinctively, exchanging brief glances that suggested something unexpected had interrupted the morning's carefully planned schedule. Ethan noticed them as well, but instead of reconsidering the situation, he interpreted their arrival as confirmation that security procedures should remain firm. He lifted his chin slightly and addressed Naomi once more. "Ma'am, I am asking you one last time to use the public entrance for visitors." His voice remained controlled, yet the confidence behind it had become increasingly rigid. Naomi answered with the same quiet composure she had shown from the beginning. "Officer Walker, I have no desire to make your morning more difficult." She paused briefly before adding, "Sometimes the hardest part of public service is recognizing that every person deserves the benefit of fairness before judgment." Ethan gave a polite but dismissive smile. "Fairness also means applying the same rules to everyone." "I agree completely," Naomi replied. "The question is whether the rules are truly being applied equally." For the first time, a faint silence settled over the surrounding hallway. A young judicial clerk lowered the folder she had been carrying. 2 attorneys who had been discussing an upcoming hearing stopped speaking altogether. Even the courthouse receptionist found herself watching the conversation with growing concern. Nobody heard raised voices. Nobody witnessed threats. Yet everyone sensed that the exchange had moved beyond an ordinary security check into something far more meaningful. Ethan extended one arm again, indicating the direction of the public elevators. "This conversation is over, ma'am. I cannot allow unauthorized access beyond this point." Naomi glanced toward the hallway he was protecting, then back at him. "May I ask one final question?" she said. Ethan nodded cautiously. "How do you determine who appears authorized before verifying their credentials?" The question lingered in the air. Ethan answered almost immediately. "Experience." Naomi's expression remained thoughtful. "Experience is valuable," she said softly. "But experience without curiosity can become assumption, and assumption has ended many promising careers." Ethan frowned. He interpreted her words as criticism rather than advice. "I know how to do my job." Naomi inclined her head respectfully. "I hope that remains true after today." Those standing nearby exchanged uncertain looks. Samuel Green, the veteran bailiff, quietly closed the courtroom door he had been holding open and took several measured steps closer, remaining far enough away to avoid interrupting, but close enough to hear every word. He had seen difficult mornings before, yet something about Naomi's calm confidence reminded him of senior judges who never needed to announce their authority because it naturally revealed itself. The lead deputy United States Marshal, Daniel Reeves, had now reached the opposite end of the corridor. His pace slowed the instant he recognized Naomi. Surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by professional composure. Rather than speaking immediately, he observed the interaction for several seconds, carefully assessing what had already occurred. Ethan, unaware of Daniel's recognition, continued speaking. "Ma'am, if someone is expecting you upstairs, they can come identify you in the public lobby. Until then, I cannot allow you to proceed." Naomi nodded gently. "That is certainly one approach." She looked around the hallway, making brief eye contact with several employees who quickly lowered their eyes. None of them had intended to become witnesses that morning, yet each now understood they were watching an important lesson unfold. Respectfully, Naomi stepped half a pace backward without showing the slightest frustration. She neither challenged Ethan's authority nor attempted to walk past him. Instead, she folded her hands around the leather portfolio and waited quietly. Her patience seemed almost impossible to explain. Daniel Reeves finally approached, accompanied by the other marshals. Their polished shoes echoed against the marble floor, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Ethan instinctively straightened his uniform, expecting an ordinary coordination meeting. Daniel stopped only a few feet away, first looking toward Naomi with unmistakable respect before shifting his attention to Ethan. "Good morning, Officer Walker," he said evenly. "Has there been a problem?" Ethan answered confidently. "No problem, sir. I am simply preventing unauthorized access to the judicial corridor." Daniel remained silent for a brief moment. His eyes returned to Naomi, whose expression had not changed since she first entered the building. The quiet in the hallway deepened. Conversation stopped. Elevator doors opened and closed without anyone stepping inside. Somewhere beyond the courtroom walls, the day continued exactly as scheduled, yet inside this single corridor, time itself seemed to hesitate. Daniel drew a slow breath, his expression revealing neither anger nor amusement, only careful professionalism. Then, with complete sincerity and unmistakable respect, he turned toward Naomi and prepared to greet her in a way that would change every assumption made that morning. "I beg your pardon, Justice Brooks." Daniel Reeves' calm voice carried effortlessly through the silent corridor, and for one brief instant it felt as though every sound inside the courthouse had disappeared. Naomi offered him the same warm smile she had given the elderly man outside only an hour earlier. "Good morning, Marshal Reeves," she replied. "I apologize if I delayed your schedule." Daniel shook his head respectfully. "Not at all, Your Honor. We have been preparing for your arrival." The words settled over the hallway like a sudden change in weather. Ethan Walker did not move. He stared first at Daniel, then back at Naomi, searching for some indication that this was a misunderstanding or perhaps an elaborate joke. None appeared. Around them, courthouse employees instinctively straightened their posture. Several lowered their voices out of respect. Others simply watched in complete silence, realizing they had witnessed the final moments before assumption collided with reality. Daniel stepped forward and spoke with measured professionalism. "Everyone, please allow me to introduce Justice Naomi Brooks." No dramatic announcement followed. There was no applause, no raised voices, no public humiliation. Only quiet recognition spread from one person to another as faces changed from confusion to disbelief. The young law clerk who had hesitated earlier slowly covered her mouth with one hand. The receptionist lowered her eyes, remembering how close she had come to intervening. Samuel Green quietly exhaled. His instincts had been correct all along. Ethan's expression lost the certainty it had carried only moments before. His shoulders stiffened as memories replayed inside his mind with startling clarity. Every assumption, every interruption, every confident decision not to verify the identification Naomi had calmly offered. They returned one after another with uncomfortable precision. "Justice Brooks," he repeated quietly, almost unable to hear his own voice. Naomi nodded gently. "Yes, Officer Walker." There was no satisfaction in her expression. No trace of triumph. Only the same calm dignity that had never left her side throughout the entire exchange. Daniel looked toward Ethan without hostility. Officer, Justice Brooks is expected in Conference Chamber 1 for the Administrative Judicial Standards Review, beginning in approximately 15 minutes. Ethan swallowed carefully. I was not informed. Daniel answered with complete professionalism. Only a limited number of personnel received advance notification. The visit was intentionally confidential. That explanation only deepened the silence surrounding them. Ethan slowly looked down at the badge attached to his uniform before lifting his eyes toward Naomi once more. Your Honor, he began carefully, if I made an error. Naomi interrupted with remarkable gentleness. Officer Walker, mistakes happen in every profession. Ethan seemed almost relieved for a fraction of a second, but Naomi continued speaking before relief could settle. The important question is not whether mistakes occur. The important question is how those mistakes begin. Ethan remained silent. Naomi continued in the same calm voice. You asked for identification, then decided you no longer wished to examine it. You reached your conclusion before gathering the information available to you. That decision deserves reflection, not because it affected me, but because the next person may not have the same opportunity to be heard. Her words contained no accusation. They carried something far more difficult to dismiss. Truth spoken without anger leaves very little room for defense. Several courthouse employees quietly exchanged thoughtful glances. They had expected embarrassment. Instead, they witnessed a lesson delivered with dignity. Daniel carefully accepted the leather portfolio Naomi handed him. Everything is ready upstairs, Your Honor. Naomi thanked him before looking once more at Ethan. Officer Walker, public trust is built one conversation at a time. Every visitor who enters this building deserves to believe they will first be seen as a person and only afterward evaluated through policy. When that order is reversed, confidence in justice begins to weaken long before anyone enters a courtroom. Ethan lowered his eyes. For perhaps the first time in many years, he realized that confidence alone could not repair a decision already made. Around the hallway, employees quietly returned to their responsibilities, but something had changed inside each of them. The conversation they had witnessed would travel far beyond the marble corridor, not through gossip, but through official process. Above the entrance, discreet security cameras had recorded every moment from Naomi's arrival until Daniel's respectful greeting. Digital access logs documented the exact timeline. Visitor records confirmed every minute. None of those systems had been designed to assign blame. They existed to preserve facts exactly as they occurred. As Daniel and Naomi began walking toward the secured hallway together, Samuel Green watched them disappear beyond the courtroom doors before turning his thoughtful gaze toward Ethan. He had spent nearly 30 years serving the judiciary, and experience had taught him that careers rarely changed because of a single dramatic event. More often, they changed because one ordinary morning revealed patterns that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The conference room overlooking the eastern side of the courthouse filled gradually as senior judges, administrative officials, and department directors took their seats around a polished walnut table. Morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long beams across neatly arranged folders bearing only a simple title, Judicial Standards Review. There were no reporters waiting outside the doors, no cameras broadcasting the proceedings, and no public announcement explaining why one of the nation's most respected jurists had arrived without ceremony. Confidentiality had always been part of the plan. Naomi Brooks preferred that important questions be answered by honest behavior rather than carefully rehearsed performances. She greeted each attendee with quiet warmth before taking her seat at the center of the table. Daniel Reeves closed the conference room doors and offered a brief summary of the morning schedule before turning to Naomi. Your Honor, before we begin, there is one matter you should be aware of. The interaction at the judicial entrance has already been preserved through multiple security systems. Naomi nodded thoughtfully. I expected that. A court administrator carefully opened a digital tablet displaying synchronized security footage from several cameras positioned throughout the entrance corridor. Every angle confirmed the same sequence. Officer Ethan Walker had stopped Naomi before asking who she was. He had interrupted her attempt to present identification. He had relied upon personal judgment rather than established verification procedures. The recording contained no raised voices and no dramatic confrontation. Instead, it revealed something quieter and perhaps more concerning. Decisions had been made before facts had been gathered. The room remained silent while the footage played. No one rushed to conclusions. The purpose of the review had never been punishment. It had always been accountability rooted in evidence. Judge Eleanor Whitmore, who chaired the Administrative Conduct Committee, folded her hands together before speaking. Justice Brooks, would you like the committee to begin a formal review immediately? Naomi remained silent for a brief moment, carefully choosing her words. I would like the committee to review the entire context, not only the final outcome, she answered. One difficult interaction rarely appears without earlier warning signs. If this morning reflects a larger pattern, then our responsibility extends beyond one individual. We must ask whether our systems encouraged careful verification or allowed assumptions to replace it. Several committee members nodded in agreement. Notes were quietly recorded. Daniel Reeves then produced the morning access log. Every movement had been documented with precise timestamps accurate to the second. Naomi's arrival. Ethan's assigned position. The arrival of the marshals. The opening and closing of secured doors. Facts rarely carried emotion, yet their consistency often spoke louder than opinions. Meanwhile, several floors below, Ethan Walker remained standing near the same entrance where the morning had begun. His shift continued, but his confidence had changed into restless reflection. Every visitor who approached seemed to remind him of Naomi's words. He found himself requesting identification from each person with unusual care, this time actually examining every credential before offering courteous directions. Samuel Green quietly observed the difference without making a single comment. Experience had taught him that genuine self-reflection often begins in silence. Shortly before noon, Ethan's supervisor, Lieutenant Maria Collins, approached with a calm expression that revealed nothing about the purpose of her visit. Officer Walker, she said evenly, when your current assignment concludes, I need you to report to conference room B. Ethan looked at her with growing concern. Is something wrong, Lieutenant? She answered professionally. The Administrative Conduct Office has requested a routine fact-gathering interview regarding this morning's interaction. Ethan understood immediately. He simply nodded. Yes, Lieutenant. As Maria walked away, Ethan leaned briefly against the information desk, replaying every moment from earlier that morning. He could still hear Naomi asking whether he was absolutely sure. At the time, the question had sounded almost unnecessary. Now it echoed differently. It no longer challenged his authority. It challenged the process by which he had reached certainty in the first place. Upstairs, the committee continued examining additional records. Previous visitor feedback forms. Employee observations. Training completion reports. None of the documents alone appeared alarming. Yet together they revealed subtle themes worth examining more closely. Naomi listened carefully without interrupting. She had spent decades understanding that institutions remained strong only when they possessed the courage to examine themselves honestly. Looking around the room, she spoke one final time before the committee recessed for lunch. Justice does not become weaker when it admits imperfection, she said quietly. Justice becomes stronger because it chooses truth over comfort. No one responded immediately. They simply wrote down her words. Outside the conference room, the courthouse continued operating with its usual rhythm, but beneath that familiar routine, a careful process had already begun, one guided not by anger, headlines, or public pressure, but by evidence, reflection, and the quiet determination to ensure that every person entering those marble halls would be judged by facts before assumptions ever had the chance to speak. By early afternoon, the courthouse had returned to its familiar rhythm, at least on the surface. Hearings continued behind heavy oak doors. Clerks delivered files between chambers, and visitors crossed polished hallways believing they were witnessing another ordinary day inside one of the nation's most respected institutions. Yet beneath that calm routine, conversations had quietly shifted. Department heads reviewed timelines instead of assumptions. Supervisors compared reports with security footage. Every fact was examined with deliberate care because everyone understood that confidence in the justice system depended upon transparency as much as authority. Officer Ethan Walker arrived outside conference room precisely on time. He straightened his uniform before knocking softly. Lieutenant Maria Collins opened the door and motioned him inside. Waiting at the conference table were Maria, Daniel Reeves, a representative from the Administrative Conduct Office named Rebecca Lawson, and a digital recorder placed neatly at the center of the table. The atmosphere was professional rather than confrontational. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody appeared eager to assign blame. Rebecca offered Ethan a courteous greeting before explaining the purpose of the meeting. Officer Walker, this is a standard fact-gathering interview concerning the events that occurred this morning. Our objective is to understand exactly what happened using documentation, recorded evidence, and your own account. Ethan nodded slowly. I understand. Rebecca activated the recorder and began with simple questions. Please describe the interaction from the moment you first observed the visitor approaching the restricted corridor. Ethan answered honestly, recounting what he believed he had seen and why he decided to stop Naomi. As he spoke, however, he noticed something uncomfortable. Nearly every explanation depended upon impressions rather than verified information. He repeatedly used phrases such as, I believed, I assumed, and it appeared to me. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Rebecca listened carefully without interruption. When Ethan finished, Daniel placed several printed photographs on the table, each captured from the courthouse security system. One image showed Naomi reaching for her identification before Ethan stopped her. Another displayed the exact moment she asked whether he was absolutely sure. A third confirmed that she had remained respectful throughout the encounter. Daniel spoke calmly. Officer Walker, can you explain why you chose not to examine the identification she attempted to present? Ethan stared at the photograph for several long seconds before answering. At the time, I believed I had already reached the correct conclusion. Rebecca folded her hands together. Do you believe that decision reflected established courthouse procedure? Ethan looked down at the table. For the first time since joining courthouse security nearly 8 years earlier, the answer seemed painfully clear. No, he admitted quietly. Procedure requires verification before conclusion. Silence settled over the room. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that follows genuine honesty. Maria Collins finally spoke. Officer, acknowledging an error is an important first step. Our responsibility now is determining whether today's incident reflects an isolated mistake or part of a broader pattern requiring administrative action. While the interview continued, Naomi Brooks met privately with Judge Eleanor Whitmore after the committee recessed. Eleanor thanked Naomi for remaining composed throughout the morning. Naomi smiled gently. Emotions rarely strengthen institutional trust, she replied. Evidence does. Eleanor studied her colleague thoughtfully. Many people would have reacted differently. Naomi looked through the conference room window toward the courthouse courtyard below, where visitors crossed the brick pathways beneath turning autumn leaves. Perhaps, she answered. But public confidence is restored by measured responses, not emotional victories. The purpose is never to embarrass an individual. The purpose is to improve the institution entrusted with serving everyone equally. Those words remained with Eleanor long after Naomi departed for her next meeting. Later that afternoon, Rebecca completed the interview and turned off the recorder. Thank you for your cooperation, Officer Walker. The Administrative Conduct Committee will review today's documentation together with relevant training records and previous evaluations before making any recommendations. Ethan stood slowly. May I ask one question? Rebecca nodded. Of course. Ethan hesitated before speaking. Did Justice Brooks request this investigation? Daniel answered before anyone else could respond. No, officer. Justice Brooks requested only that the facts be reviewed fairly. Nothing more and nothing less. Ethan absorbed those words in complete silence. As he stepped back into the hallway, The courthouse no longer looked different, yet somehow everything had changed. For the first time, he realized that authority was never measured by how confidently someone judged another person. It was measured by the discipline to seek the truth before reaching judgment, and before the day was over, that lesson would reach far beyond one officer, one hallway, or one difficult morning. Evening settled over Washington with a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the questions still circulating inside the courthouse. The final hearings concluded one by one as attorneys packed their briefcases, courtroom lights dimmed, and employees slowly made their way toward the exits. Outside, the last golden rays of sunlight reflected across the courthouse columns, while inside, several offices remained illuminated long after normal business hours. The Administrative Conduct Committee had not rushed its work. Every statement, every security recording, every access log, and every interview transcript had been reviewed with careful attention. Justice, Naomi Brooks often reminded younger judges, was never strengthened by speed alone. It was strengthened by patience guided by facts. Shortly after 7 o'clock that evening, Judge Eleanor Whitmore reconvened the committee for its final session of the day. Around the conference table sat department directors, legal counsel, training supervisors, and representatives from courthouse security. No one appeared eager to speak first. They understood that whatever decision emerged would influence more than one employee. It would communicate the standards expected throughout the institution. Eleanor looked around the room before opening the discussion. "Our responsibility is not to evaluate personalities," she began calmly. "Our responsibility is to evaluate conduct, adherence to procedure, and the public trust placed in this courthouse." Daniel Reeves presented the final chronological summary. The evidence revealed no dispute about what had occurred. Naomi Brooks had approached respectfully. She had attempted to present identification. Officer Ethan Walker had interrupted that process and relied upon personal assumptions instead of required verification. The interaction remained professional in tone, yet the departure from established procedure was equally clear. Rebecca Lawson then reviewed Ethan's interview. She noted that he had acknowledged his decision, accepted responsibility for failing to verify identification, and expressed no disagreement with the factual record. She also explained that previous evaluations reflected solid attendance and dependable administrative performance, but they included several coaching notes encouraging greater patience during interactions with visitors. None of those observations alone justified serious discipline. Together with the events of that morning, however, they established a pattern the committee could not ignore. Silence filled the room once more. Finally, Eleanor looked toward Naomi. "Justice Brooks, before the committee concludes its deliberation, is there anything you wish to add?" Naomi folded her hands thoughtfully. "Only this," she answered. "Today is not about one officer. It is about preserving confidence that every citizen entering this building will receive equal dignity before any conclusion is reached. Accountability should never be mistaken for revenge. When institutions refuse to examine themselves honestly, public confidence slowly disappears. When they do examine themselves honestly, confidence begins to return." Her words settled gently across the room. No one challenged them because the evidence already supported every conclusion that needed to be made. A formal vote followed. It was deliberate, respectful, and unanimous. The committee recommended immediate administrative action, mandatory procedural review, expanded training for courthouse security personnel, and temporary removal of Officer Walker from active public contact duties, pending completion of the disciplinary process. The recommendation would proceed through the established chain of authority before becoming official the following morning. There would be no dramatic announcement, no crowded press conference, and no attempt to embarrass anyone publicly. Institutions built upon law rarely required spectacle when facts spoke clearly for themselves. Across the building, Ethan remained seated alone inside the staff break room, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside him. He had already guessed that important decisions were being made upstairs. Yet what weighed most heavily on his mind was not uncertainty about the outcome. It was Naomi's quiet question from earlier that morning. "Are you absolutely sure?" He now understood that the question had never challenged his authority. It had challenged the certainty he placed above verification. Looking around the nearly empty room, Ethan noticed framed photographs honoring retired officers who had served the courthouse with distinction for decades. Beneath each portrait appeared the same simple inscription: integrity before authority. He had passed those photographs hundreds of times without giving them much thought. Tonight, the words carried an entirely different meaning. Shortly before leaving the courthouse, Daniel Reeves encountered Naomi walking toward the main entrance. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "the committee has completed its recommendations." Naomi nodded gently. "Thank you, Marshal Reeves." Daniel hesitated before asking, "Do you believe today's events will make a difference?" Naomi looked through the courthouse doors toward the quiet city beyond. "Only if people remember that justice is measured by ordinary moments," she replied. "Great institutions are protected not only by laws, but by the character of those entrusted to carry them out." With that, she stepped into the cool evening air and disappeared into the gathering twilight, while inside the courthouse, the final documents awaiting morning approval rested silently on polished desks, ready to ensure that when the sun rose again, accountability would arrive not with anger, but with the steady weight of truth. The first light of dawn stretched across the marble steps of the courthouse, painting the stone with soft shades of gold as another workday quietly began. Commuters crossed the streets carrying coffee cups, city buses followed familiar routes, and the American flag above the courthouse moved gently in the cool morning breeze. To anyone passing by, nothing appeared unusual. The building stood exactly as it had the day before, dignified and unwavering, a symbol of stability in the heart of the city. Yet inside those walls, one important chapter had already come to its conclusion. At precisely 6:30 in the morning, Officer Ethan Walker reported to Lieutenant Maria Collins' office after receiving a brief message requesting his presence before the beginning of his shift. He entered wearing the same neatly pressed uniform he had proudly put on hundreds of times before, but today his confidence had been replaced by quiet reflection. Maria greeted him respectfully and invited him to sit. On the desk rested a sealed administrative folder together with several official documents bearing signatures from the previous evening's committee review. She spoke calmly, allowing every word to carry its proper weight. "Officer Walker, following the Administrative Conduct Committee's findings and the recommendation approved this morning, your authority to perform active courthouse security duties is suspended effective immediately pending completion of the disciplinary process. As required by policy, you must surrender your courthouse credentials and badge before leaving this office." Ethan remained silent. There was no argument because the evidence had already answered every question that needed to be asked. Slowly, he unclipped the silver badge from his uniform and placed it carefully on the polished wooden desk. He then removed his identification card and set it beside the badge. The sound was almost imperceptible, yet to Ethan it felt heavier than any speech could have been. Maria looked at him with professionalism rather than satisfaction. "This decision does not define your entire career," she said gently. "What defines your future will be what you choose to learn from this moment." Ethan nodded. "I understand." He stood, thanked her for treating him with respect throughout the process, and quietly walked toward the office door. As he stepped into the hallway, he noticed employees beginning another ordinary day. Some greeted him politely. Others simply continued their work. There were no whispers, no public spectacle, and no celebration. Accountability had arrived exactly as Justice Brooks believed it should, through established process rather than public humiliation. Across the building, Naomi Brooks entered her chambers carrying the same weathered leather portfolio she had carried the previous morning. She paused briefly beside the window overlooking the courthouse plaza, where visitors of every background slowly gathered before security checkpoints opened for the day. Watching them, she thought again of her father's words from so many years earlier. Character reveals itself most clearly when no one important appears to be watching. The lesson had never been about becoming important. It had always been about remembering that every person deserved equal dignity whether anyone recognized their name or not. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered, carrying the committee's finalized report. "Everything has been completed," she said. Naomi accepted the folder but did not open it immediately. "Thank you," she replied. Eleanor smiled thoughtfully. "Your restraint yesterday reminded everyone why institutions need leaders who value fairness over personal victory." Naomi looked once more toward the courthouse entrance below. "Justice is never about proving who has the greater power," she answered quietly. "It is about ensuring that power never replaces humanity." Later that morning, courthouse staff gathered for a brief training update where supervisors introduced revised verification procedures emphasizing respectful communication, complete credential review, and unbiased application of policy. No names were mentioned. The lesson belonged to everyone, not only one officer. As employees returned to their assignments, the atmosphere felt subtly different. Small changes rarely make headlines, yet they often become the foundation upon which lasting trust is rebuilt. Outside, the sun climbed higher above the city's skyline, illuminating the courthouse columns with quiet brilliance. Visitors continued entering through its doors carrying hopes, concerns, and expectations that they would be treated fairly before judgment was ever formed. Some would never know what had happened the previous day. They would never hear Naomi Brooks' calm voice or Ethan Walker's difficult realization. But perhaps that was the greatest measure of justice. The institution had chosen to correct itself without seeking applause. And somewhere beyond the courthouse steps, life continued as always, carrying with it one simple truth that would outlive every title, every uniform, and every badge. The law earns its greatest strength not when it commands respect through authority, but when it protects every person's dignity before reaching a single conclusion.